Hey, what is up guys, Zarnix here, and today we are talking about the best export settings in Premiere Pro, at least for 2020. Now, back when I started, I didn't know that the export settings in the export panel was actually important, but it is important because it determines your final video's quality. I mean, you can shoot all this beautiful 4K, 6K, 8K raw footage even, but if you don't have the right export settings, it's gonna do those footage no good. So don't disrespect your footage like that, and today I'm going to show you guys all about the export settings. We'll talk about compression, we'll talk about bit rates, we'll talk about profiles and all the other stuff, and I'll give you guys different settings for different cases. For example, if you want to upload it to YouTube, or if you want to give it to a client, or if you're running out of space, or if you want to cut down on your render times. So there are different settings for each of those different settings. Now, without further ado, let's jump right into Premiere Pro. Now, I have a project pulled up here. This is a video I made about me trying to edit a whole video on Premiere Pro with using only a PS4 controller. Pretty crazy. If you guys want to check it out, you can click right here or here on that card. I actually don't know which one, but anyway, let's get to the export settings, and you can do this by hitting Control M on your keyboard. That is the shortcut to pull up the export settings panel. Now there's our export panels, or you could also click on File and Export in Media, but it's just the same thing. I think Control M is much quicker. Now let's go through the settings one by one. First of all, we have the format. Now this format determines what kind of compression that you are going to have on your final video. Now if you're opening Premiere Pro for the first time, I don't know if the default is set to AVI uncompressed. Now AVI uncompressed means there is no compression at all on your final video whatsoever. That means you do not lose any quality at all in your final video, but that results in a huge, massive, enormous file size for your final video. So generally you don't want to do that. I mean, if you have all the space that you can have, I mean, go ahead and do lossless or uncompressed, but that's not really practical. So you want some compression on your video, but not too much to the point where it lowers the quality of your video significantly or obviously, and not too little up to the point where it is just massive in terms of file size. So a famous format for compression is H.264, and this will result in an MP4 file format. Similarly, you can use H.265, which is just a much more efficient encoding, but it also results in an MP4 file format. It also results in the same amount of quality and the same amount of file size. I know some people out there use QuickTime, but personally, I don't use that a lot. I just stick with H.264 or MP4. And I believe this is also the best format for uploading to YouTube, so that's a bonus. And another bonus for using H.264, at least in Premiere Pro, is that you can use hardware encoding. Now recently, Premiere Pro has supported hardware encoding using your dedicated GPU instead of just your integrated graphics. So that means the software is able to use your dedicated GPU in rendering, which will cut down significantly on your render time. So that's a big bonus. All right, so that's it for format. It determines what your compression will be. Next is preset. The preset will determine all your other settings down here. Similarly, you can tweak the settings down here and you can save it as a preset so that next time you don't have to like input all your export settings all over again. And normally I don't touch with preset unless it's my own preset. Next, we have the output name. Now, if you click on output name, you will not only be able to change the name of your final video, but you can also determine where your final video will end up. So if you click on the name, you can choose to redirect where your final video will be. Next, we have checkboxes for export video and export audio. Say you just want to export the video with no audio at all, you can uncheck export audio. And if you do want to export only the video, I recommend that you uncheck export audio, because I think that's going to save up on render times, and it's also going to make sure that there's no weird thing going on, at least with audio. Next, we have the summary, which represents all your other settings down here. So there's that. And down here we have a few panels. We have effects, video, audio, multiplexer, captions, and publish. Today I will touch mostly on video, and personally I only touch video. I don't touch all these other panels, because when it comes to the quality of your final video, it really has much to do with with only the video panel. Now moving on, we have basic video settings. Now for this settings, I recommend that you use match source. Match source means your resolution and your frame rates will match that of your project settings. And it's really important that you keep at least the frame rate the same for your project settings and export settings, because if you have different frame rates between your projects and your exports, your final video will end up having some distortion, maybe some ghosting or interlacing. So because of that mismatch in frames per second. So if you really want to change the settings on this, I recommend that you do that in your project. Do that in your project and see if anything weird comes up and fix it, and then go back to export and just use match source. Say that your project is in 1080p and then you want to export it to 4K. I recommend that you change it to 4K in your project settings, because that ensures that there's no weird things going on in your final video. But anyway, in this tab, we have the resolution, we have the frame rate, we have field order, which I always keep it at progressive. We have the aspect, which I keep at square pixels 1.0. And then we also have this checkbox called render at maximum depth. Now, I personally always check this box. This ensures that you are rendering at the maximum quality possible. So there's no harm in doing that. Well, maybe it's going to take longer in rendering times, but we're here for max quality. All right, next up, we have encoding settings. Now, this is a bit exciting. First, we have the performance. We have hardware encoding and software encoding. As I said earlier, Premiere Pro only recently supported dedicated GPU hardware encoding. That means you can speed up your render times because you will be using your dedicated GPU for rendering. There's kind of a caveat with using hardware encoding. First, it only supports H.264 or H.265 formats, and it also only supports encoding types of constant bitrate and VBR1 pass, and we'll talk about that later. And I've heard people say that hardware encoding actually has a reduction in quality as compared to software encoding, but it's like a really small reduction in quality that I think it's negligible, especially for the amount of time that you get to cut with hardware encoding. So if you're really worried about that, you can stick with software encoding, but if you really want to cut down on your render times, use hardware encoding. It's especially beneficial for doing 4K projects or lengthy projects that are half an hour long or 1 hour long. I think you should use hardware encoding. Next, we have profile, and I usually leave this at high. What profile basically determines is what is the maximum bitrate that you can have for your videos. And we'll talk about bit rates later as we go down the settings. But for now, let's just leave it at high. As for a level, I usually keep it at around 5.1 or 5.2. If you're feeling a little fancy, you can go with 6.0 or 6.1 if you're feeling it. And then we have this tab called mastering display color volume. It's grayed out for me, so I don't touch that anyway. And then there's content light levels, same with the previous one. And then there's bitrate settings. This is another exciting thing to talk about. Now, bitrate is generally how much information there is in your video, how much information there is in every second of your video and every frame of your video. And it is measured in megabits per second or mbps. So the higher the bit rate, the more information you're going to have in every second of your video, which means there will be higher quality in every second of your video. Yes, high bit rate equals high quality, but high bit rate also means higher file size. So it's sort of like a trade-off between file size and quality. That's the general idea. If you want more quality, you're going to have more file size. And when it comes to encoding, there are 3 types of encoding, at least in Premiere Pro. We have CBR, or constant bitrate, we have VBR1 pass, we have VBR2 pass. Now, when it comes to types of encoding, I use some of them, and it depends on what I want to do with a final video. Now, I use CBR if I want to upload it to YouTube or if it's for safekeeping. I believe CBR brings the highest quality that you can get, but it also gives you the highest file size. When I use CBR or constant bitrate, I would put the target bitrate as 100 mbps. Now, constant bitrate as compared to VBR will ensure that each second of your video receives the same amount of information. So CBR will give you a constant quality among all parts of your video. And just to give you some perspective, this project is a 4K project that is 22 minutes long, and if I use CBR 100, the final video is going to end up to be 16 gigabytes. I know. It's huge, but it's gonna pack up the most quality that you can get, especially compared to VBR. And if you're feeling fancy, you can bump up the bitrate to like 300 even, if you have the space for it. All right, so now this is for uploading to YouTube. And when it comes to uploading to YouTube, we all know that YouTube has their compression. So in order to combat that compression, you need to make sure that you have packed the most out of the quality of your final video in the first place. Because if you start out with like a video with a low bit rate at the first place, and then further compression is just gonna end up in, I don't know how it's gonna look like. But yeah, I use CBR 100 for uploading to YouTube, or if it's just for safekeeping. But if I want to give it to a client, or if I'm running out of space, if I want to give it to people, I don't want to give it in a large file size. So I will use VBR 2Pass instead. What VBR does, or variable bitrate, is give different levels of information depending on each part of your video. So if this part of your video has a lot of movement in it, it's going to give a lot more information to that part. But if a part has no movement at all, it doesn't need as much information, so it's going to give less of a bit rate to that part of the video. Now, the only caveat to using VBR 2Pass, at least for now, is that it doesn't support hardware encoding. So if you really are concerned about time, then you probably don't want to use VBR 2Pass. You can use VBR 1Pass, but we'll get to that in a second. As for VBR 2Pass, it takes a long time because the software will pass through the video twice. The first pass is going to be to determine which parts of your video need more information and which parts do not need as much. And then the second pass is for the rendering itself. As for the parameters, we have two. One is target bitrate and the other is maximum bitrate. You can see target bitrate as your minimum bitrate and then your maximum as your maximum bitrate. So if I'm using VBR 2Pass, the whole idea is to shrink the file size. So I would put the target bitrate as 15 and the maximum bitrate as 50. Now again, this same project will result instead in a 2.5 gigabyte video. I know. From 16 gigabytes to 2 gigabytes. That's the whole point of me using VBR 2Pass. Now that I have a 2.5 gigabyte video, it's much easier for me to give it to other people or share it to other people. But say you need to cut down on your render time, say that time is really your concern, then I recommend that you use VBR 1Pass instead. I believe this will result in a slightly lower quality than VBR 2Pass, but it's still gonna be good. As for its parameter, we only have one, which is target bitrate, and just set it to whatever you would set for your target bitrate if you were using VBR 2Pass. So if you would put 15 as your target bitrate in VBR 2Pass, then put 15 for VBR 1Pass. And it's going to result in roughly the same amount of file size. And that's all for bitrate settings. Next, we have advanced settings. I don't touch that usually. VR video, I don't make VR video. And then down here, we have a few checkboxes. Now, please check use maximum render quality. Come on, the name says it all. Similar to render at maximum depth, it's gonna ensure that you are rendering at the maximum quality possible. Next, we have use previews. Now, previews are pre-rendered frames or already rendered frames in your project timeline. So if you check use previews, the software will use those already rendered frames to be in your final video. So it's not gonna re-render that already rendered frame, which should cut down on your render times. But I do not recommend that you use previews unless your previews are rendered at the maximum quality, or at least the quality that you want it to be. Because if your previews are rendered at a quality that is lower than what you want it to be, then it's going to use that lower quality frame to be in your final video, and you don't want that. When in doubt, just uncheck use previews. Do not check use previews. Just let the software re-render everything from scratch. As for all these other checkboxes, I don't touch them usually. And on the bottom, we can choose Q or export for our final rendering. If you press Q, it's going to add to the Adobe Media Encoder queue. If you choose export, it's going to render in Premiere Pro itself. Now, personally, I always use Q, and that is for a number of reasons. Reason number one is that it will log all your export settings in the queue. So that means if it crashes while it's rendering in Media Encoder, all you have to do is just reopen Media Encoder and just re-render it with a click of a button. You don't have to re-enter re-enter your export settings all over again, which is nice. Another reason is that while it's rendering in Media Encoder, you can still work on Premiere Pro. You can still use Premiere Pro. You know, if you're working on a different project and you want to render a video and work on a different video at the same time, or if you want to export a frame from that same project, you can do that. Now, if you choose export, however, it's going to render in Premiere Pro itself, so that means you're not going to be able to use Premiere Pro while the video is rendering. And if it crashes in the middle of rendering, you're going to have to open Premiere Pro again. And I don't know for sure, but you might have to re-enter all your export settings all over again, unless you have a preset. As for render times, I actually don't know if Media Encoder has a faster render time than Premiere Pro does, but I sort of believe it does. I sort of believe that Media Encoder is faster in rendering than Premiere Pro, but I actually don't know if that's true. But anyway, that's it. That's all for me. That's all I have for you guys in terms of the best export settings for Premiere Pro. I just want to thank you guys for watching this video. If you like it, please hit that like button. If you're willing to hit that subscribe button, I'm trying to reach 500 subscribers. I'm almost there, and that would mean I'm halfway in reaching 1,000 subscribers. I'm trying to hit 1,000 in this year, so if you're willing to help me on that, I really appreciate it if you do. But other than that, that's it. I just want to thank you guys again for watching. I'm Zarnix, and I'll see you guys in the next video.